guys are doing well today. Enjoying this fall weather that you have to wear like 3 layers at 7 a.m. and then be like in a bathing suit by 4. So it's great way of dressing up for stuff. One of my favorite TV shows of the last year is called The Bear. I don't know if any of you have watched. It's basically the story about this sandwich shop in Chicago that the main guy that runs it, he's like this super talented, like world-class chef. So they turn a sandwich shop into like this Michelin star level, like fancy restaurant. And the second season, there's this one episode called Fishes. And the episode is like the main guy, he comes from an Italian-American background. So they have this Christmas dinner that's called like the Feast of the Seven Fishes thing it's called. It's like common in certain places, like every dish is like some sort of seafood thing. And the episode was considered by like critics like the best TV episode of last year. Won all sorts of Emmys, all sorts of things. And what makes the episode so compelling is that the whole episode is this Christmas dinner of a family of people who basically hate each other, right? Everybody is incredibly dysfunctional. There's alcoholism, there's codependency, there's money problems, there's people lying and not telling the full truth. And the whole episode, it's incredibly tense to watch because you think that it's going to break out into like a fist fight of some sort. I won't tell you what happens. I won't ruin it for you if you want to go check it out. It's really great. But anyway, I think one of the reasons why that episode was so popular was because the people watching, maybe us, that we've been in those situations before, right? Maybe you've been in a holiday dinner where you know that these two people like just have this natural tendency to go at each other, and the second somebody says, "So, did you see the news last night?" Everybody starts like tensing up because you don't know what's going to happen, right? Let's be honest. Maybe you've been in that situation in the past. I'm not going to say that. I can't say between us, but you know, okay? Why is that? I would argue that's because relationships are hard, right? And this is true of family relationships, of co-workers, friends, neighbors. How much of the stress and maybe sometimes even the regrets of our lives happen in the context of the relationships that we're in? Now, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, there's this added layer of complexity because we believe we're called to love everybody always, right? Not only our friends, but our enemies as well. Our lives are meant to be this reflection of the love that God has for humanity. And the question then is, how do I do that when I have this toxic friend who is clearly emotionally manipulative? How do I do that with my coworker who I know is a bad influence on me? How do I do that with my relative who has, the complete opposite worldview that I have, and that every time that we're in the same room and we get past the basic greetings and start talking about anything of substance, it's guaranteed that things are going to devolve into a fight? Now, we're about to enter the holiday season, which historically is never stressful or tense for anybody, particularly when you visit your relatives. And I say that as my parents and my sister here visiting from like out of the state. So, this applies to everybody. We're in the middle of a very civil, non-polarizing election season. So I don't see any reason why any of us would experience any sort of conflict or tension in our relationships in any way. But just because it's a Sunday, and we need to talk about something for the next 30 minutes, okay? I want to explore what it looks like to set up guardrails when it comes to our relationships. I'm not talking about just like marriage. Next week, Chaz and I will talk about parenting and how we raise our families. I just want to talk about the other relationships, right? Our friendships, our relatives, our coworkers, our neighbors, the people who, outside of our immediate family, we spend the most time with and who, let's be honest, have influence in our lives. The quality of those relationships affect how we think and how we feel and how we act. Then there can be a positive effect. Sometimes there can be a negative effect, which means that, we might need guardrails to keep those relationships from having negative, and I would argue even sometimes destructive effects in our own lives. So with that, I want to invite you to go with me to the book of Romans, chapter 12, and I'm going to start reading on verse 9. Romans 12, chapter 9. Don't just pretend to love others. Really love them. Hate what is wrong and hold tightly to what is good. The Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the church in Rome, and it's a fascinating setting because, Rome is the capital of the Roman Empire, which means the people from all over the world, and you know anything about history, let's say the ethics or lack thereof of Rome were very different to the ethics of Christians. So there's this level of like, if you're a Christian and you're living in Rome, you either feel this like, alienation from the people that are not Christians in your city. Maybe you are tempted by the French international we have to live in a way that now it's not right. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you think, oh, I'm a Christian, I'm saved, and those Roman pagan citizens, like, they're terrible, and you're judging them and you're looking down on them. So there's that one level of relationship dynamics. And then within the church itself, like, you have a church that's composed, we've talked about this before, from like non-Jewish Gentiles that became Christians, and they had kind of like our own set of worldviews and values that were sometimes not the same as the Jewish people who became Christians. And the church in Rome is interesting because the prior emperor to when this letter was written, we think it's Claudius, he had kicked out the Jewish population from the capital. And what happened then is like the church that was there, Jewish people get kicked out, they start kind of like just doing church and developing all their behaviors and customs just like Gentiles, because there was no one else to say anything different. The emperor dies, Jewish people are allowed to come back into Rome, and all of a sudden you have all these Jewish people say, wait, why are you eating this? Why are you doing that? Why are you, like, none of these things were things that we think it's okay to do. And you have this whole other layer of relationship conflict. So Paul is writing to this group that experiences all sorts of these things, and it's fascinating to me that the way in which he's kind of like talking about relationships and relational guardrails, he starts with love. He says, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. And I think that's interesting, and I wanted to start here because there's a version of this message that's basically, don't associate with sinners because you're better than them, and like anybody that gives you trouble and any toxic relationship that you have, just like write them off, kick them out, and live your life. And on one level, honestly, part of the best we're going to talk about is like, when do we associate with people and all that, but it's a very easy temptation to just push people away and to separate ourselves from people. And very slowly, what that does to us is that it makes us people that are more judgmental and more self-righteous and alienates us from the people that God calls us to love. Robert Frost has, this very famous poem. Maybe you had to learn it in high school, Mending Wall. And the poem is all about how, the boundaries that we set from other people alienate us from each other. If you remember the poem, Robert Frost going on this walk with his neighbor, and they're kind of like, going along this fence, and they get to a point, and Robert Frost is saying, I don't think we need a wall here, right? Like, because you have pine trees on your side, and I have apple orchards on my side, why do we need a wall? And then the neighbor replies that very famous line, good fences make good neighbors. To which Frost replies, but why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I has to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall than what's in down. What's Frost saying? What Frost is saying is the motivation of why we set up guardrails or boundaries of some sort has a certain degree of effect on the type of people that we become and the type of relationships that we have. And it seems the first implication is that our intention shouldn't be just to alienate for the sake of alienating, but actually to try to build relationships and connections. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, which seems to be a counterintuitive way to start a conversation about relationship boundaries and guardrails. But I think that here in this passage, Paul is making the same point, that the starting point for how we think about the people that we're in relationship with is not how toxic they are or how annoying they are or maybe how better we think we are, how more moral we think we are, how more career-driven we think we are. The starting point should be love. And I find it interesting also that Paul kind of like digs between how we pretend sometimes that, and he gets very explicit. He says, don't pretend to love people, implying that a lot of us are in relationships with people that we pretend to love. Where somebody was to take a look at how we treat each other and how we live and what we feel and think in our hearts, we might not be loving them. The question then this morning is, what does this mean when we think about guardrails in relationships? Now, remember what we said the first week of the series, that a lot of guardrails are very contextual to our own circumstances and our own spiritual and emotional makeup. But what I want to do this morning is I want to help you think in different categories where you should need to set up some guardrails, and look out for dangers. So here's the first category I want to give you based on that verse: the love guardrail. Okay, the love guardrail asks this question: is how I'm acting or feeling in this relationship moving me away from love or toward love? Am I setting up boundaries because I hate this person and I don't want to see them, I want to be done with them? The first question should always be, do we love these people? Or more specifically, how am I loving these people in the context of this situation? And Paul gives you a very, very right away, like a very practical application or saying of this. He says this: hate what is wrong. Paul is looking at one of the first things that might come to our minds when we're thinking about guardrails, right? How do we love people with whom we disagree? Or maybe even people that can have a bad influence on us. Can we love them? What does love look like in that setting? And Paul's answer seems to be, yes, you can love them. And you should. And he says, but by the way, loving somebody doesn't mean that we agree with everything that they do or think or say. Which seems pretty straightforward, except that it's actually really hard to do because we do one of two things, right? Either because we disagree with them, or maybe it's beliefs, or maybe it's, lifestyle, or maybe it's just kind of like how they live their lives or whatever. And we tend to basically think, okay, because I'm supposed to hate what is wrong, that means I'm supposed to hate you. And I'm supposed to judge you. And I'm supposed to criticize you. And I'm supposed to attack you every time we interact. Or the other side of that then is kind of like, well, because I'm supposed to love you, I'm kind of like supposed to like ignore everything and pretend everything is okay and never say anything. Sometimes even that means that I end up being in situations that I shouldn't be, letting you even have more of an influence that you should have in my life that then can have very negative consequences. So what Paul is saying is this: you don't have to choose one or the other. You can love people and you can hate what is wrong. You can love your friend or your neighbor who thinks different from you, votes different from you, has made different choices than you've made, without that meaning that you endorse every point of view or decision they've made. And you can love your friend who does things that you know he or she shouldn't be doing, without hanging out with him or her doing those things, and maybe even having to take a step back from that relationship and distancing yourself from some practices or behavior. I'm convinced, honestly, guys, that one of the most critical and underused spiritual and emotional skills we need is the ability to hold things in tension. We need to be able to walk and chew gum. You know who was really good at that? Jesus. Jesus can hang out with Pharisees, with tax collectors, with prostitutes, with all the people that nobody else wants to hang out. And is never, in most of the cases, is not judgmental. He is not mean. He is not cruel to people that he disagrees with that are clearly sinners. And also, he's able to hang out with those people, and nobody's accusing Jesus, and all of a sudden, starting like an illegal gambling ring in his basement, right? Like he's able to hang out with people, not becoming like influence negative, and also not turning into a judgmental person against others. And I think that part of what it means to follow Jesus is to learn to do that. There's a reason why Paul has taken those two ideas together in this passage. Paul is concerned about our ethics and our behavior, and we'll look at that in a second. But before he's concerned about that, the main thing that he's concerned about is that we can become self-righteous and less loving and more judgmental. And before we guide ourselves about, being infected by somebody else's worldview, and because we get concerned about, hanging out with people that can be a bad influence, we have to guard our hearts from letting hate take root in them. And Jesus actually talks about it. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Then he says, hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. How do we guard ourselves from moving away from love, from becoming less loving, more judgmental? It's by spending more time looking inward and repenting of our own sin, and hopefully through that becoming aware that we're no better than anybody else, that we are sinners who have found grace in Christ, and that the same grace has been extended to everybody. Now, you go back to that last line. Hate what is wrong. The first base thing to guard ourselves out from is to guard ourselves about becoming not loving people, right? They love guardrails. But then, there's also this reality, okay? You have to be wise about people who are not making wise decisions. And again, remember, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, which means to me that the second category for guardrails, it should be the ethical or moral guardrail. You know, what happens when the people we're in a relationship with either see the world in a completely different way that we may, or, you know, maybe have values that are against biblical values. What happens when, you know, when relationships with people that are engaging in behavior that may be ethically dubious or even morally wrong? Well, Proverbs talks about it. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. Walk with the wise and become wise. Associate with fools, says Mr. T, and gain trouble. Trouble chases sinners, while blessings reward the righteous. One of the things that we said earlier is that for some of us, some of the greatest regrets that we have are connected to relationships that we have, right? Maybe we were hanging out with the wrong crowd when we were younger, and we did things that we repent of, that we regret. Maybe, the amount of conversation I had when I was working mostly with young adults, it's fascinating to me. I would talk to so many people that were like the nicest people you could think about, and they would say something like, I wasn't a good person when I was in college. And they would just kind of like say, I was living my life in such a way, and I was dealing with this crowd, whatever. There was kind of like this regret because of the relationship that they had turned them into a particular kind of people that they didn't like when they looked in the mirror. One of the ideas in the book of Proverbs is that both wisdom and foolishness are contagious. And sometimes when we have with unwise people, the foolishness becomes contagious. And what ends up happening is that the closer we are to them, the more likely that we are to catch the shrapnel of the consequences of those bad decisions. The Pastor Andy Stanley in Atlanta, he talks about this topic. He says this: friends who aren't careful with their lives won't be careful with your life. Which means that you can love your friends regardless of how they think, act, or behave, and it's still wise to set up some guardrails. Now, I'm going to tell you what those guardrails should be. I think that's very contextual, but Andy Stanley gives us, I'm just ripping this off from him, okay? It gives us 5 things to consider. It's almost like lights in the dashboard, that when I find myself in these situations, maybe it's time to set up a guardrail. Like, first one is this. When it dawns on you that your core group isn't moving in the direction you want your life to be moving. Okay? Last time I was here, I was sharing you the story about this accident I found myself in, and how that was like a crucial moment in like my faith. And one of the things that happened out of that is that I realized I was hanging out with the wrong crowd. Like, I had these friends that I had known from high school, and we ended up in the same college, and they just wanted to party every weekend, every week, all the time. And I was becoming that type of person that was sending my life in a particular direction. And that moment kind of realized, okay, they're going this way, and I'm not sure that's where I want to go. Number 2, when you catch yourself pretending to be someone other than who you really are. Or to kind of like clarify that more a little bit, when you're agreeing on the outside with things that you disagree on the inside. And that might be, bad behavior or bad things. You know more often what that looks like? A lot of times it looks like gossiping. A lot of times that looks like talking and saying things about other people that are not in the room, and we don't care, and we're like, I don't think that, but sure, let's make fun of that person. Okay, so there's things that kind of, when that's happening, that should light up a light. Number 3, when you feel pressure, I hope I didn't break something. A light or no, man? I don't know. Check on that. Okay, when you feel pressure to compromise, when something that before wasn't a real temptation, all of a sudden starts becoming a life option. When there was something that you had never occurred, that you'd never be on your radar, and because you're hanging out with a person or a particular group of people in particular settings, all of a sudden you're driving home like, man, maybe next time I should, you never know, right? Number 4, when you catch yourself thinking, I'll go, but I won't participate. And the message that Stanley talks about, I remember saying, would you buy that from your 14-year-old? Say, hey, Dad, hey, Mom, I want to go to this party. There's all these bad stuff that are going on, but You can trust me, okay? I'll go, but I won't participate. You're like, no, why don't you stay home, okay? And sometimes we don't do that to ourselves. I think I'm an adult, I can handle this, and can you? Number 5, when you hope the people you care about don't know your whereabouts, okay? When you find yourself in certain settings, you're like, I'm not doing anything right or wrong, but let's just turn off Life 360 for a second. What? Okay? You guys know what I'm talking about, okay? Now, so those are kind of like just like some tools for when to know, okay, maybe it's time to set up some guardrails in this relationship. Now, that isn't the only dynamic where we need guardrails. I would argue that the other dynamic is what I would call toxic or adversarial relationships. So back to Romans chapter 12. Let's go down to verse 14. This is what it says. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Now, you read this and you hear persecution, and the first thing that you're thinking is more like Roman soldiers chasing Christians, arresting people, throwing them into jail. Yes, that's one of the core kind of like ideas here. But I would argue that there's another way that we can think about this passage I want us to invite us to consider this morning. That's those relationships in our lives that we probably classify as difficult or even toxic sometimes. People who are in our lives, maybe it's a coworker or a family member or a friend from childhood. People that you can just write off willy-nilly, you know what I'm saying? People that for some reason or another, you're going to see them the rest of your life. Maybe it's at a family event, some function. For some of us, it's family members. For some of us, it's siblings. For some of us, it's aunts, uncles, grandparents, sometimes even parents. And yet, your relationship with that person is marked by strife and conflict. Every time you're interacting with them, you feel like they bring out the worst in you. The people that, if you do counseling or therapy, right before you're going to see them and right after you're going to see them, like that's all you're going to talk about in your counseling and therapy session? Okay. How do we deal with those relationships? Because chances are that you feel one of two ways. Either you profoundly dislike them, and if we're honest, maybe you even hate them, and loving them is the farthest thing from your mind, and yet you feel like you're stuck with them in some way. Or you feel this tension within you that Jesus calls you to love them, and you just don't know how to do that well. And maybe you feel like for the sake of love, you are letting them walk all over you and mistreat you. And, after every interaction that you have with them, all you feel is like rage, or you just want to like cry in a corner. Sometimes that's how we feel about our toddlers when we're dropping them off to preschool. That's ever happened to me. Okay. Now, the question then is it, why do we do in those relationships, right? Can we love well? Can we set guardrails that protect us from giving our hearts into hate, and at the same time they create some healthy patterns in our lives? We're not just trapped into this cycle of toxicity and sometimes even abuse, right? And the Apostle Paul gives us some instruction here. The first thing he says is to set up a guardrail, but it's not the guardrail that you would think, which is the one we jump to immediately, which is cutting people off. It's a different guardrail. Look at this, verse 14. Bless those who persecute you, don't curse them. Verse 17, never pay back evil with more evil. Verse 19, dear friends, never take revenge. Isn't that fascinating? Paul's first concern is not how to cut people off or keep people out. Paul's first concern is what those relationships will do to us and what we will do as a consequence of that. That they say this, and because they say this, you say this, and then like they raise their tone up a little bit, so now you raise their tone up a little bit, and before you know, you're like in a TV episode of family fighting at Christmas dinner. What Paul says to do is to set up what I would call the guardrail of retribution. The way that we get out of the cycle of toxicity, of the cycle of constant strife and infighting, is to refuse to take revenge. And Paul gives us this very practical advice on how to do that. Verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. It's interesting. What Paul is saying is this. And again, none of this has ever happened to anybody here, okay? But we have a big holiday coming up. We're going to make trips. We're going to see family. And maybe you're going to see people that, some of this stuff may apply to, right? And chances are that the weeks leading up to that, the days leading up to that, you're going to see that person. And all you're thinking is that you're going to see that person. And the stress is building up, and the anxiety is building up, and in your mind, you're just rehearsing the conflict that's going to happen. You're going to see them, and if inevitably the big blow-up happens, what you're going to do the next few days or the next weeks, you're going to be thinking about that person. You're going to be watching the dishes. You're like, how could she, like, and then, and like you have this anger. And again, never happened to me. Okay. And you have that frustration. And what you're doing is your heart is meditating in the hate that you have for that person, the dislike that you have for the anger that you have for that person. And Paul says, actually, what you can do for that is that you can fight that doing the opposite. Is that you can pray for them. You can actively think of them and bring them before God. And Paul takes this step further because he's not saying actively thinking and bringing them before God with like imprecatory songs, right? Like, God, throw my enemies against the walls. No, he's saying what? Pray that God will bless them. But what happened is as you're getting ready to see that person, you spend the next few weeks asking for God to do good to them. And let me tell you, getting a fight with somebody that you've been praying for weeks, that you want God to do to them, it's a little bit harder. It's almost like Paul is saying at the ground. Now he's continuing saying, verse 15, be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Here is an interesting thing. What he's saying here is like, we have this tendency to, even if, when we're like actively wishing ill to people, when that ill happens, we celebrate a little bit. You're like, oh no, you got fired from your job for stealing money. I know you were doing that. How sad. You know? Every time the Yankees lose, couldn't have happened to nicer people. So sad. Right? Or you get feeling whatever you like. And what Paul is saying is actually, no, you have to do the opposite. He says, you have to weep in those weep. You have to mourn, to join people in their grief and suffering, and then to be happy with those who are happy. That when something good happens to somebody, our first instinct is not to, how can the wicked keep getting away with that? He's like, you know, I'm glad that they're happy. I'm not envious of them, and I don't just celebrate their adversity. Now, the next thing, live in harmony with each other, says, don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. Don't think you know it all. What I would say here is this, live in harmony. Don't go in looking for the fight. Because it's not only that we're dreading the conversation because you know what's happening. We're building our arsenal, right? Like, we're like, you know, Cold War United States, like doing a nuclear program, just like writing up, you did this, and I have the screenshot of that thing, and I have that text saved, and I know what your sister told me, and you're just writing it down, and you know, if she ever says something, man, I'm pulling out a bazooka. And you're just like, ta, 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 ta. And Paul says, actually, what would happen if you go into the conversation, decided not to fight, and to live in harmony? And you're actively trying to keep the peace. Would it be different? Verse 17. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you're honorable. I think the point Paul is getting to here is that eventually, if we don't do those things, we get caught in the cycle of toxicity, and we become just as toxic. And we think that the fact that they're doing that to us allows us or authorizes or qualifies us to do the same thing to them. So if they say an insulting thing, we say that then it's okay for me to say the insulting thing. And what Paul is saying, if you think that that's wrong, what you're doing is wrong too. So don't pay back evil with evil. Act in a way that's honorable. Which takes me kind of like to a point that needs to be said, right? Verse 18. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. You're probably going, okay, when do we cut people off? Let's talk about cutting people off for a second, which I'm not going to say cut people off, but this is kind of like what I want to get. Paul says, do all that you can to live at peace with everyone. The key operating word here is all that you can, okay? The thing about relationships is that they require two or more people, right? Which means that by yourself, you can try to be as healthy and as loving, as wise as possible, and maybe sometimes the other person is just not interested in that. And there's a moment you have to learn to set the right boundaries. Why? Because we just looked at the previous verse, that if you don't, and if you get caught up in the cycle of toxicity, that toxicity is spreading to you, and sometimes that toxicity is spreading to other people. I love that in the verse is like acting in such a way that everybody who sees you is honorable. Let's think for a second. Those of us who have families, who have children, right? Where's usually the context that we get into big fights or arguments? Family functions, right? Who's usually present in family functions? Children. When we allow toxicity to infect us, and we act on that toxicity, we start modeling to our children that that's how you're supposed to relate with people. If I can be like honest with you for a second, Those of us are little kids and who have parents are older than us, and maybe, well, they're always older than us, but you have parents in the next stage of life. And maybe we don't have the best relationship with our parents. When we act, how we act with our parents is how we're teaching our children to act with us when they have our age and we have our parents' age. I'm just going to drop that and walk away and go back to my message, okay? Anyway, next thing that he says, verse 19, dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God, for the scriptures say, I will take revenge, I will pay them back, says the Lord. This is kind of like the gist here, okay? What makes this difficult is that let's assume for a second that we're always in the right and they're always in the wrong. And they're the toxic person, we're like the healthy, well-adjusted person. And when they're acting in a toxic manner, when they're acting maybe in a manipulative manner, we're acting in an abusive manner, it feels like we have to fight it somehow because that's wrong and they can't keep getting away with it. And every time we like say something or bring our daggers or whatever, part of what's going on inside of us is like, it's so unfair, it's so unjust. And what God seems to be saying is like, that's not the case. He says, if that's the case, then leave it up to God. Being loving and being forgiving and setting up boundaries, all this is, the thing that God is trying to get at is that you are not the judge of the world, that God is. And bearing that weight will crush you. So yes, sometimes we have to set up boundaries, right? He said, in as much as you can. When you can, you need to set up boundaries. Boundaries on when you hang out, how you hang out. Sometimes the boundaries, I'm not going to take the bait. If you want to bring out that topic that you know that brings us, I'm going to walk away from the room. I'm not going to have this conversation. I love you or care for you. I'm not going to insult you. I'm not going to demean you, but I won't let you drag me into this. Some side of the base say, no, we're not going to go on that trip. And if we go on that trip, this is how we're going to act on that trip. It's okay. It's healthy to set up boundaries. I'm not saying no. The point is that where our hearts are at. And the way that we do that is that we leave it up to God. We say, God, you deal with this. And the way that we actually do this is what goes on next. It says, instead, if your enemies are hungry, it says, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, I love this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. What's Paul saying? Paul saying, you know what the best way in which you expose the negativity and the toxicity and the dysfunction is by acting in the opposite way. And the contrast of that shows the world what's right and what's wrong. You loving somebody is not just you taking it, it's you showing there's a different way to live. And at some point, that is a public witness to who God is and to what the right way of being in relationship is. Then he closes with this. He says, don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. The whole point that Paul is trying to get at is, if you don't set up the right boundaries, the right guardrails when it comes to relationships can be toxic, abusive, bad influences, whatever it is. At some point, evil will conquer you. Where that means that you will become a person that's full of hate and resentment and judgment. Where that means that you become a person that gets, taken over by that influence and your life goes in a way that's not supposed to go. Where that means that you continue to perpetuate the cycle of toxicity and dysfunction in your family, in your friendships, in your relationships. And he says the way you do that is by conquering evil, by doing good. And I don't think that that's just something that protects our hearts. I think that part of what's going on here is that's a way that eventually God can get to the other person. And your goodness and the way that you're acting with honor and with love and with kindness and with health can get to them and show them God's love and maybe even heal them and change them. Because here's the thing. We were them at some point, weren't we? We're honest. Sometimes we're still them. And if Jesus had to decide who he associates with, based on how functional or dysfunctional they are, on how toxic or non-toxic they are, or how good of an influence or bad of an influence they are, I'm not sure we make the cut. Jesus shouldn't be our friend. Sometimes I think I'm Jesus' toxic friend. But when I show you this, just a few chapters before in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 5, verse 10. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his son, but we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his son. So now we can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends of God. God became our friend. And it's not that he just chose to look past our own dysfunction and our own toxicity and our own abusive and manipulative behavior and our own bad influences. He came into the world, became a human being, incarnate himself, died for our sins so that he could conquer our evil by his good. That somehow in Jesus, the possibility for our relationships to be changed, for us to change, has been made possible. And what if we went into this holiday season? What if we went back into our neighborhoods and working spaces and group chats and whatever else that we do and engage with people with that mentality? One of the most famous local chefs is a guy named Jose Andres. I don't know if you heard, he has a bunch of restaurants in DC, and he has this nonprofit called World Central Kitchen. They do a lot of work feeding first responders in difficult situations. And whenever he was starting that, I remember that he had this line over and over. He says, we don't need to build longer walls. We need to build bigger tables. The place where things can be healed is at the table. Now, for some of us, that sounds ironic because some of the memories that we have of the most strife, of the most, conflict, it's at the table. Some of us are ready to go back home with those people and sit at a table with them, and we're dreading the fight.